They thought she was just a fragile recruit, until even a sniper called her Mom. Among them stood a slight figure that immediately caught his attention for all the wrong reasons that would later prove catastrophically misguided. Private Sarah Chen, barely 5'4" and weighing perhaps 120 pounds soaking wet, clutched her M4 carbine with hands that seemed too small for warfare and too delicate for the brutal realities of modern combat operations. Her uniform hung loose on her diminutive frame, like borrowed clothes from an older sibling, and when she spoke during morning roll call, her voice carried none of the commanding presence Hayes expected from soldiers destined for deployment in hostile territories, where hesitation meant death and weakness invited fatal exploitation by enemy forces who showed no mercy to those they perceived as vulnerable or unprepared for asymmetric warfare. This was supposed to be advanced tactical training for elite combat units, not a daycare center for military hopefuls who had watched too many Hollywood action movies and confused entertainment with brutal reality of close quarters combat in urban environments where every corner could conceal death and every decision carried life or death consequences for entire teams operating in zones where political correctness became a luxury that combat units couldn't afford without paying prices measured in American lives lost to enemy action. Hayes had seen Chen's type before during his 23 years of military service that included 3 tours in Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces and 2 deployments to Iraq's deadliest urban combat zones, where survival depended on split-second decisions and physical capabilities that couldn't be taught or learned, but were either present or absent in individuals who volunteered for service. Eager young women who thought they could play soldier until reality hit them like armor-piercing rounds through Kevlar. Body armor, shattering not just their bodies, but their naive illusions about gender equality in environments where physical strength, endurance, and decision-making under extreme stress determined who lived and who died in situations where weakness could prove fatal. Not just to individuals, but to entire squads operating in hostile territory where America's enemies employed increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics designed to exploit any hesitation or vulnerability among forces operating. Without adequate backup or support, today's exercise would separate the wheat from the chaff with surgical precision, using scenarios designed to replicate stress, confusion, and life-or-death decision-making required in actual combat situations where hesitation meant death and poor judgment resulted in mission failure that could compromise not just individual lives but entire operational objectives that had taken months of planning and intelligence gathering to establish successfully. The personnel file in Hayes's office told a disappointingly standard story that raised more red flags than a Soviet military parade, filled with bureaucratic language that obscured rather than illuminated the true capabilities and limitations of the soldier standing before him in the crisp morning air of a North Carolina training facility that had prepared thousands of warriors for combat deployments, testing every aspect of their physical, mental, and emotional preparation for the ultimate trial of modern warfare against enemies who understood local terrain, population dynamics, and architectural features that could be exploited to neutralize technological advantages that American military forces had traditionally relied upon to achieve battlefield superiority in conventional conflicts. Chen had enlisted 8 months ago through standard recruitment channels, completed basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, with scores that Hayes considered mediocre at best, and somehow managed to request assignment to combat units despite obvious physical limitations that would make her a dangerous liability in real firefights, where every team member's survival depended on the competence and reliability of their teammates, in situations where weakness could prove fatal, not just to the individual, but to entire squads operating in hostile territory where enemies showed no mercy to those perceived as unprepared for the realities of asymmetric warfare that had evolved far beyond conventional battlefield tactics into something approaching urban guerrilla combat, demanding new skills and capabilities from soldiers who would face threats that previous generations of warriors had never encountered in their most challenging deployments overseas. Her psychological evaluations showed determination and above-average intelligence. But Hayes had learned through hard experience to distrust paperwork assessments over battlefield instincts, honed through years of combat operations where survival depended on accurate threat assessment and the ability to identify potential problems before they manifested as casualties that could compromise mission effectiveness and endanger other personnel, operating in environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences for individuals and their families back home. Today's exercise at the abandoned warehouse complex would test every recruit's limits using scenarios specifically designed to break seasoned veterans and reveal fundamental truths about who possessed the combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and tactical instincts necessary for survival in combat environments where enemy forces employed increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics designed to defeat American protective equipment and tactical doctrine that had proven inadequate for complex urban combat environments, characterizing modern asymmetric warfare in Middle Eastern cities, where American forces faced enemies who understood local conditions and could exploit architectural advantages to neutralize technological superiority that had traditionally given American military forces decisive advantages in conventional battlefield engagements. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy that reminded Hayes of pre-deployment meetings in Iraq, where young soldiers tried to mask their fear behind bravado and professional competence that would either sustain them through their first firefight or crumble under pressure that separated those who talked about combat from those who could actually perform when bullets started flying. And theoretical training confronted the brutal reality of people trying to kill them with weapons designed specifically to defeat American body armor and tactical doctrine developed through decades of conventional warfare experience. Using satellite imagery and tactical displays that cost more than most soldiers made in a year, Hayes outlined the day's scenario with methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation where every detail mattered and any oversight could prove fatal to the patient lying unconscious on the operating table waiting for decisions that would determine whether they lived or died based on the competence and preparation of medical professionals responsible for their care. A simulated hostage situation in the abandoned warehouse complex, complete with live ammunition exercises, psychological pressure tests designed by military psychologists who understood the mental stresses of combat, and surprise elements specifically intended to push participants beyond their breaking points and reveal who possessed the mental flexibility and tactical instincts necessary for special operations assignments that demanded capabilities far beyond standard infantry training and conventional military doctrine that had proven inadequate for the asymmetric warfare environments that characterized modern combat operations. Chen sat in the back row of the briefing room, her dark eyes scanning the tactical displays with an intensity that surprised Hayes momentarily, before he dismissed it as rookie eagerness rather than recognizing it as the focused attention of someone analyzing threat patterns and tactical opportunities. With the systematic approach of a professional warrior who had learned to read battlefield conditions with the same careful attention that a surgeon reads medical charts before making incisions that will determine whether the patient lives or dies during complex operations requiring precision and expertise developed through years of training and practical experience in high-stress environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences. When Hayes called for questions about the exercise parameters and safety protocols designed to minimize risk while maintaining realistic training conditions. She raised her hand tentatively and asked about extraction procedures and backup communication protocols that actually demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking far beyond what Hayes expected from someone with her limited documented experience and training background that should not have provided the knowledge base necessary for such astute tactical observations about potential vulnerabilities in the exercise design. But Hayes had already made up his mind about her capabilities based on visual assessment and unconscious gender bias that he wouldn't admit to possessing even under oath in a military court-martial proceeding designed to determine whether his command decisions had contributed to unnecessary casualties among the soldiers under his authority and responsibility for their safety and professional development. The other recruits, mostly men with military backgrounds, ranging from prior enlisted service to college ROTC experience, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their expectations for the petite Asian woman among them, their expressions revealing assumptions about combat capability and gender roles that reflected broader cultural biases within military organizations that had been slow to adapt to changing demographics and evolving concepts of warfare that increasingly valued intelligence, adaptability, and technical skill over traditional measures of physical strength and aggressive masculinity that had characterized previous generations of military culture. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Hayes's senior instructor and a veteran of multiple combat deployments who had earned his position through demonstrated competence under fire rather than political connections or bureaucratic maneuvering that sometimes influenced military promotions and assignments, had quietly suggested giving Chen a support role rather than frontline assignment that would expose her to maximum risk and potential danger during the exercise. But Hayes wanted her to experience firsthand why certain people belonged in certain positions within military hierarchy that had evolved over centuries of warfare to maximize survival rates and mission effectiveness through careful matching of individual capabilities with operational requirements that demanded specific combinations of skills, temperament, and physical attributes that couldn't be taught or learned through training alone. The equipment room smelled of gun oil, canvas, and the metallic tang of weapons that had been cleaned and maintained according to military specifications designed to ensure reliability in combat conditions where equipment failure could mean death. For soldiers, depending on their weapons to function properly, when their lives depended on mechanical precision and reliability that could only be achieved through meticulous maintenance and quality control procedures. Recruits suited up in tactical gear that would either save their lives or become their burial shrouds depending on decisions made under pressure that separated those who could think clearly during combat stress from those who froze or panicked. When confronted with the reality of people trying to kill them with weapons specifically designed to defeat American protective equipment and tactical doctrine developed through decades of military experience and technological advancement. Chen struggled initially with her equipment harness, the tactical vest seeming designed for someone twice her size and weight, but Hayes noticed with grudging professional interest that she eventually achieved proper fit through persistent adjustment and mechanical problem-solving that demonstrated aptitude beyond her apparent inexperience with military equipment and procedures that typically required extensive training and practice to master under the time pressure of combat preparation, where delays could compromise mission timing and operational security that protected both individual soldiers and broader strategic objectives. As teams formed up for the exercise with the precision of a military formation that had been drilled until individual movements became automatic responses to verbal commands and tactical situations, Hayes positioned himself at the command post. with perfect sightlines to the entire training area through high-definition cameras and real-time GPS tracking systems that would record every movement, decision, and tactical choice for post-exercise analysis designed to identify strengths and weaknesses in individual performance that could be addressed through additional training before soldiers faced similar situations in actual combat environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences for individuals and their units. Operating in hostile territory without adequate backup or support from conventional military forces. The first phase of the exercise involved a 2-mile run in full gear to the warehouse complex, a distance that separated conditioning pretenders from soldiers capable of maintaining combat effectiveness after physical exertion that simulated the exhaustion and stress of actual military operations, where troops might be required to fight effectively after hours of movement through hostile territory while carrying equipment loads that would challenge even well-conditioned athletes operating. Under ideal circumstances, Chen fell behind immediately during the initial sprint, her shorter stride no match for longer-legged recruits who pulled ahead like thoroughbreds, leaving the starting gate in a race where physical capability determined position and tactical advantage in ways that could prove decisive when the exercise shifted from endurance test to combat simulation, requiring fresh troops capable of executing complex maneuvers under pressure and stress that would reveal who possessed the fundamental attributes necessary for survival in environments where weakness invited exploitation by enemy forces trained to identify and attack vulnerable targets. Hayes shook his head as he watched her through military-grade binoculars that provided crystal-clear magnification of individual soldiers struggling with equipment and terrain that had been specifically chosen to challenge physical capabilities and mental resilience in ways that would reveal who possessed the fundamental attributes necessary for survival in combat environments, where weakness invited exploitation by enemy forces trained to identify and attack vulnerable targets among American units operating in hostile territory without adequate intelligence support or backup capabilities that conventional military doctrine assumed would be available during combat operations. But something remarkable happened during the final half-mile sprint to the objective that caught Hayes's attention and forced him to reassess his initial judgments about Chen's capabilities and potential for military service in combat units that demanded peak physical performance under extreme stress and life-threatening conditions. She had somehow managed to close the distance gap that had separated her from other recruits, her breathing controlled despite obvious physical strain, moving with fluid efficiency that seemed at odds with her earlier clumsiness and suggested training or experience that her personnel file didn't document or explain adequately through normal military career progression that should have provided such capabilities through documented training programs and operational experience that would be reflected in official records and performance evaluations. The warehouse complex loomed against the grey morning sky like a concrete monument to industrial decay and urban blight. 3 massive buildings connected by narrow catwalks and maintenance passages that created multiple entry points, blind corners, and hiding spots that would make any tactical team's worst nightmare come true. In scenarios where enemy forces could exploit architectural advantages to ambush, trap, or eliminate American personnel operating in unfamiliar terrain without adequate intelligence about potential threats or escape routes that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, resulting in casualties that would haunt commanders and families for years after the immediate tactical situation had been resolved through military action or strategic withdrawal. Team Alpha, led by Staff Sergeant Martinez and consisting of 4 experienced recruits with prior military service, moved through the exercise area with professional competence that reflected their training and experience in military operations. Team Bravo included college graduates with ROTC backgrounds, but no actual combat experience, their movements revealing theoretical knowledge without practical application. Team Charlie, where Chen had been relegated to rearguard duty based on Hayes's assessment of soldiers requiring additional evaluation, represented his judgment about personnel whose capabilities remained questionable and whose presence in combat units might compromise mission effectiveness. Through his headset connected to sophisticated communication systems, Hayes monitored the chatter of commands, confirmations, and coordination protocols that would determine success or failure in scenarios where mistakes were measured in casualties rather than training scores. The warehouse interior had been extensively modified to replicate urban combat environments found in Middle Eastern cities, complete with concrete barriers simulating blast damage, mannequins representing civilian populations, and simulated booby traps that would test decision-making under pressure and reveal who possessed the mental discipline necessary to follow rules of engagement while maintaining tactical effectiveness. 28 minutes into the exercise, everything changed with terrifying suddenness that transformed routine training into a genuine crisis. A new voice crackled through communication systems with cold professionalism that made Hayes's blood freeze as he realized that unknown hostile forces had somehow infiltrated his training area and taken control of the tactical situation in ways that suggested sophisticated planning and detailed intelligence about the exercise. Unknown snipers had taken positions in surrounding buildings that overlooked the warehouse complex, transforming the training exercise into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated through proper military channels that maintained strict control over live fire exercises and security protocols. This wasn't part of Hayes' carefully planned scenario, and the realization that actual threats had somehow penetrated military security perimeters sent shockwaves through his understanding of the situation that left him responsible for young lives, hanging in the balance of decisions he was no longer qualified to make without backup, support, and intelligence about enemy capabilities that he simply didn't possess. The distinction between simulation and reality had vanished in an instant that transformed training exercise into potential combat situation, where the lives of American military personnel were at risk from unknown hostile forces whose capabilities, intentions, and rules of engagement remained completely unknown. The first shot shattered morning air with deadly finality that echoed across the compound like thunder announcing approaching storms that would test everyone's courage, training, and ability to function effectively under life-threatening pressure. Through his scope, positioned in the eastern tower, an unknown sniper had fired at Team Alpha's position with precision that spoke of professional military training and intimate knowledge of American tactical doctrine. The bullet embedded itself in concrete wall inches from Martinez's head with accuracy that demonstrated the shooter's capability to kill American personnel at will, while choosing instead to issue what amounted to a warning shot that established hostile control over the tactical situation. Hayes grabbed his radio with hands shaking from adrenaline and command responsibility, shouting orders for immediate extraction while his mind raced through contingency plans that suddenly seemed inadequate for the crisis unfolding before his eyes. Most recruits were freezing up in ways that would guarantee death in actual combat situations, their training evaporating under pressure that separated theory from brutal reality. All except one. Through multiple camera angles, Hayes watched Chen move with composure that seemed impossible given her apparent inexperience and the chaos erupting around her position. She directed teammates to appropriate cover positions while maintaining visual contact with potential sniper nests, identifying threats with accuracy that suggested military training far beyond basic instruction. Her movements displayed tactical awareness that should have required years to develop through combat experience. and she coordinated defensive positions with natural authority that commanded immediate obedience from soldiers who had previously dismissed her capabilities based on physical appearance and gender assumptions that suddenly seemed dangerously irrelevant when bullets started flying and survival depended on tactical competence. As Hayes coordinated backup procedures with higher headquarters, Chen did something that stopped him cold. She stepped into the open courtyard between warehouse buildings, rifle lowered in universal military gesture of non-aggression, and looked directly at the sniper position in the eastern tower with confidence that suggested prior knowledge of the shooter's location and capabilities that she shouldn't have possessed unless she had access to intelligence information that hadn't been shared through normal military channels. For moments that stretched like hours, while Hayes waited for the shot that would end a young soldier's life under his command, nothing happened except radio chatter of personnel trying to coordinate responses to a tactical situation that had evolved beyond their training and experience. Then, impossibly, the shooting stopped completely, leaving an eerie silence that suggested some form of communication between Chen and the unknown sniper that had somehow resolved the immediate threat through methods that Hayes couldn't comprehend. The sniper's voice came through a handheld radio that Chen had somehow acquired, his words cutting through static with military precision that made Hayes's skin crawl with recognition of protocols he wasn't supposed to know existed. The conversation was brief, professional, and conducted in terminology that suggested both participants shared classified information and operational experience that exceeded standard military training programs. When it ended, the sniper had addressed her as ma'am with deference that implied recognition, respect, and something approaching the fear that elite soldiers showed only to those whose reputations preceded them into combat zone. Hayes descended from his command post like a man walking into a nightmare he couldn't comprehend or control. As he approached the courtyard where Chen stood calmly coordinating safe withdrawal of other recruits, he began noticing details that should have registered earlier but had been overlooked due to preconceptions about her capabilities. The way she held her weapon suggested muscle memory, developed through years of combat experience rather than recent basic training. And her tactical awareness kept her constantly scanning for threats while appearing relaxed. A contradiction possible only among soldiers who had survived multiple deployments in hostile territories. Most disturbing of all, Hayes now recognized a small insignia on her collar that belonged to a unit that was officially non-existent, a group so classified that even colonels weren't supposed to acknowledge their operations or personnel. The sniper emerged from his position with hands raised, not in surrender, but in professional courtesy that Hayes recognized from interactions with special operations personnel whose existence was officially denied. When the sniper looked at Chen, it was with unmistakable respect that one professional killer shows another. Hayes approached them with growing unease as Chen turned to face him, her entire demeanor transformed from uncertain recruit to something far more dangerous and competent than he had imagined possible. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried quiet authority of someone accustomed to command in situations where hesitation meant mission failure and death. The truth, when it emerged, challenged everything Hayes thought he understood about military hierarchy, training exercises, and the true nature of the woman he had so casually dismissed. Chen was not her real name, nor was she actually a private, in any conventional sense that Hayes understood from his decades of military service and command experience. The entire training exercise had been an elaborate test designed by forces operating far above Hayes's security clearance level to evaluate something he was only now beginning to understand with growing horror at his own incompetence and blindness. Two obvious signs that should have identified her true nature and purpose. She had been sent to assess not the recruits under his command, but him personally, his methods, his ability to recognize talent regardless of its packaging, and his fitness for continued leadership positions that required sound judgment about personnel capabilities under extreme stress. The sniper had been part of the controlled evaluation, a known element designed to create genuine crisis that would reveal true capabilities when lives hung in the balance and reveal who possessed the mental flexibility necessary for command positions in special operations that operated outside normal military hierarchy and accountability systems. Hayes had failed spectacularly, his preconceptions and unconscious biases blinding him to obvious signs that should have immediately identified her as exactly what she was. A member of an elite unit whose very existence was need-to-know information that he definitely didn't need to know according to security protocols that protected both individual operators and national security interests. Standing in the courtyard with morning sun climbing higher and casting new shadows across the training ground that had become the site of his professional humiliation and career-ending revelation. Hayes found himself facing the brutal truth about his own limitations as a military leader responsible for evaluating and developing personnel whose lives would depend on his judgment about their capabilities and fitness for combat operations. The woman he had planned to dismiss from military service stood before him now revealed as his superior in ways that went far beyond rank or conventional experience, representing capabilities and authority that existed outside normal military structure and challenged his understanding of how modern warfare actually operated. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for his future military career. In warfare, as in life, the most dangerous enemies and the most valuable allies often came disguised as exactly what you least expected them to be, and commanders who couldn't see past surface appearances to recognize true capability were unfit for positions where such blindness could get soldiers killed in real combat situations where mistakes were measured in American lives lost to enemy action. The exercise was officially over, but Hayes suspected his real education about military leadership, personnel evaluation, and his own dangerous limitations had just begun with consequences that would follow him for the remainder of his career and beyond, as Chen coordinated the safe withdrawal of all personnel with the same quiet competence she had displayed throughout the crisis. Hayes realized that his recommendation for her dismissal from military service would instead become his own professional epitaph, a permanent reminder that competent leadership required the ability to recognize talent and capability regardless of how it was packaged or whether it conformed to traditional expectations about who belonged in positions requiring ultimate sacrifice for mission success and national security objectives that remained hidden from officers whose security clearances and need-to-know status didn't extend to the shadowy world of special operations that protected American interests through methods and personnel that officially didn't exist.